Good evening. We're continuing our study of Mark, and we are moving toward the end. It will take us some time because we do it very thoroughly, as you know. Put me on the large screen, Joe, please. Okay.
There you go.
Now let's review a little bit. Jesus is in Jerusalem, the last section of Mark, and I say over and over again how carefully it's constructed. This is the last section and the longest section. And some people have said that Mark is really a passion narrative with introductions. The passion means the suffering and death of Jesus, the most important thing here. However, well, for Paul, it was the most important thing. 50 AD, Paul was writing his letters and he cared only about the meaning of the death of Jesus on the cross. What does it accomplish? Is it just the death of a great man, or does it win us salvation from the sins that Adam committed when he gave in to the snake, which Christians interpret as the serpent, as Satan in the Garden of Eden? And Paul said the whole world fell into sin and death. So God has to send a second Adam to undo the work of the first Adam. In the first Adam, we all fall. In the second Adam, we are given another chance at intimacy with God and eternal life, the things that Adam lost in the Garden of Eden. And that's Paul's formula, which has become the dominant formula of the Christian religion, fall and redemption. And of course, it differs from the Jewish view, where Judaism does not believe in original sin, that we inherit Adam's sin. Therefore, we ourselves can deal with sin. God gives us the Torah as a new tree of life. And by obeying that Torah, we can use our human free will in the right way. It wasn't totally compromised in Eden, and achieve, at least theoretically, a degree of righteousness. In Paul's analysis, we cannot, because the evil is not what we do, it's what we are. We have become sin. And Jesus has to sacrifice himself in our place. The death we deserve, he dies. And then we are free to be intimate with God once again. The chasm opened by Adam's sin is closed by Jesus' sacrifice. But he didn't say anything about Jesus' life. Mark tells us so much about his view of what Jesus' life was like. He arranges it topically. We don't know if it's chronologically correct. A great deal of it probably does go back to Jesus. And a great deal of it is Mark speaking in the late first century. This is the great dilemma of New Testament scholarship. It says Jesus said this and Jesus did that. When is that accurate? And when is it the late first century church, through Mark, telling legends about Jesus that have formed in the 40 years since he died? It's very hard to tell. And especially in this last section. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. The whole gospel has been a journey from the north to the south. We understand why Yankees might want to come down here, don't we? And so he starts in Galilee in the north, and he comes down to Jerusalem in the south. And he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey to fulfill the prophecy of the humility of the Messiah in Zechariah. And somebody praises him and waves palms to greet him. Are these the people of Jerusalem? Or are these the people he brought with him? It's impossible to tell. A scholar might say, well, how would the people of Jerusalem have even heard of him? So why would they greet him effusively like this? And if they did greet him effusively, then why, a few days later, are they screaming for his crucifixion? I've heard sermons on that constantly. Well, that's not difficult to answer. It's a different crowd of people. But it may very well be that the people who spread the palms are the people he brought with him. Certainly not just 12 disciples, but their families. And Peter is married, and some of the others could be. And all kinds of, there are women there. That in the Gospel of Luke, he talks about all the women who took care of the disciples. So he might have come with a large crowd. So who is it who praises him? Whoever it is, and it's an open question. They don't understand him even as they greet him. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that is about to recommence. They hail him as the Davidic Messiah who will take the throne of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, cast out the Romans, establish Israel as a righteous kingdom, and then the righteousness will spread from sea to sea. That's what people expected of him. That's not what he did. He may be the Messiah according to Christian definition, but he isn't the Messiah according to the David Zion tradition of taking the throne of Jerusalem, a Messiah with a political agenda. Jesus has a spiritual agenda. It's very different. So even as they greet him, whether it be the people of Jerusalem or the ones he brought with him, they misunderstand what he's going to do. And they still don't understand, those disciples. After 3 times hearing him talk about his suffering and death, they don't get it because it's something so new. It was never attached to messianic expectation in Judaism. So they haven't absorbed it yet. Well, he rides into Jerusalem. That's Sunday, according to Mark. Now, this is his arrangement day by day, and we have no idea whether it's factual according to the way Jesus lived it, but he arranges everything in Jerusalem in 1 week. Gospel of John disagrees entirely. So let's follow Mark. That's what we're reading. This is the story. He rides into Jerusalem on Sunday. He goes up to the Temple Mount for the first time. He enters the enclosure. He looks around, but it's late. He doesn't say anything or do anything. He goes back to Bethany, a suburb, where he's staying. Apparently, if he knows what's going to happen to him, he wants to be arrested when he wants to be arrested. He has things to say, and he can't spend the night in Jerusalem. It's too dangerous. Because the Romans, once he was acclaimed as the king at the gate of Jerusalem, the Pontius Pilate must know all about him by this time. The high priest doesn't yet, but he will the next day. So that's Sunday. Monday, he goes back to the temple and he tells the parable of the fig tree, or we have the story of the fig tree, which withered. Now, the fig tree in this case represents the temple. It's a metaphor. And when Jesus wants fruit from the fig tree, it doesn't yield. When God wants fruit from the temple, it doesn't yield it. So Jesus is very much clearly against the Sadducees and their temple cultus of animal sacrifice. So he goes in there on Monday with his staff and he begins smashing the tables of the money changers, and I've explained why there would be money changers there, and of those who sell animals. Now, it's not just that he objects to the making of a profit on the sale of religious services. It's much more than that. He knows perfectly well that if the people can't change the money into temple money, they can't buy sacrificial animals. And if they can't buy sacrificial animals, the sacrifice at the inner court of the temple will cease. He's attacking the whole system, as Jeremiah had 600 years before. And as he does it, he quotes Jeremiah. My house should be called a house of prayer for all people, Isaiah, and you've turned it into a den of robbers, Jeremiah. 600 years earlier, Jeremiah had told people not to come to the temple. The distinction between prophetic Judaism and priestly Judaism in the pre-exilic period, the period of the prophets, was enormous. There was no one Israelite faith, you had two. And they were fighting with each other, prophets against priests. Jesus is clearly in the line of the prophets to a great extent, not completely, as I've discussed, but to a great extent. So he attacks the whole priestly system in a more intense way than Jeremiah had. Now, the response of Pasha, the high priest, when Jeremiah told people not to come to the temple, was to beat him up and put him in the stocks. Here, the high priest must have looked out his window when Jesus was breaking up all the booths and the cages and said, what is all this chaos? The animals are running around and the birds are flying off. Who is that man? Whoever he is, he's got to go. He's attacking the true faith of the temple. And I believe the Sadducees were quite sincere in their belief that if the smoke on the altar stopped going up to heaven, the link between heaven and earth would be destroyed and the world would end. We know they were not correct. The temple was swept away in 70 CE, but this is what they believed. So Jesus attacks the whole idea and becomes persona non grata, to say the least, in the eyes of the high priest. And then he leaves. And the high priest wants to arrest him. But because of his popularity with the people, he can't. Now, Jesus may not have been known the day before, but the things he's doing in that temple seems to appeal to people. Maybe this prophet is right. Maybe we don't need animal sacrifice anymore. Maybe we should go to a higher level of religion, which Judaism did once the temple was destroyed 40 years later. And they're beginning to think, maybe the fellow has something to say. High priests can't afford that. Jesus leaves after causing chaos. The next day, Tuesday, he comes back. And I think we did that, the anti-temple sermon. And it's in terms of a vineyard. And it's based on Isaiah, who talks about a vineyard that becomes corrupted and God is displeased. And that's the nation of Israel. The prophets are always attacking Israel as not being good enough. Jesus uses the same terms and he tells a parable. But you have to see him, imagine him in this vast temple courtyard. And way across the courtyard is the temple building, this tall structure with a canopy of gold on top. It's described by Josephus as one of the great buildings of the world. And Jesus says, a man planted a vineyard. And I imagine he pointed out all of this, the temple, the vineyard. And he surrounded it by a hedge. And that's the great wall of the temple. It was 30 feet across, so soldiers could march up and down. And then he put in a tower. Well, that would be the temple. And a wine press, appropriate to a vineyard, but here it would mean the altar. And he let it out to tenants. The tenants would be the priests, the Sadducees. But they corrupted everything and didn't yield to God what he expected, like the fig tree. What will he do? He will come and displace those tenants and give it to somebody else, the vineyard. Now, this can mean, remember, did Jesus actually say this? He could have. Or it could be Mark speaking in the wake of the destruction of the temple, which is one of the reasons he sat down to write the life of Jesus. So Jesus probably did predict the destruction of the temple. Whether he gave this speech or not, I don't know, but he may have. And the priests perceived he made the speech against them. And once again, they want to arrest him, but they feared the people. So again, the people seem to have been won over by Jesus' rhetoric, which must have been extraordinary. And he's really planting doubt in their minds as to whether the temple is a valid institution anymore, or whether it's outlived its usefulness. So the high priests are after him. After those 3 visits and his final sermon, the vineyard sermon. And they're going to look for a way to get rid of him. They can't do that. Only the Romans can do that. But they can assist. According to the text, they do. All right. It says in chapter 12, verse 12, after that sermon, they tried to arrest him, but feared the multitudes, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. And so they left him and went away. Well, it wouldn't take a genius to know that he preached it against them. All right, so he leaves on Tuesday. But before he leaves, he has several encounters with people. The first people are sent by the Sadducees to see if they can entrap him. The problem is the people are listening to him. They've got to entrap him in words to make him say something that will destroy his popular base before they arrest him. They won't succeed, but they're going to try. You can see their problem. So chapter 12, verse 13. After trying to arrest him, but deciding not to because of his popularity. They've got to break down that popularity. Verse 13. They sent to him, that is the high priests, some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians. The Herodians would be the people who support the reign of King Herod. They were a political party. And they came to entrap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, this is the first challenge. Rabbi, we know that you are true and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men, but truly teach the way of God. Well, if you're going to entrap someone, you begin by complimenting them. There's always a but after. I have the greatest respect for you, but truly you teach the way of God. Here's a question for you. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? What a trap. If he comes out and says, oh yes, pay your taxes to Caesar, the people might think he's an agent of Rome. They already suspect the Sadducees of being so, and in many ways they are. They made a deal with the governor to who would be high priest. And they just bribed him. So the Talmud says that the Holy Spirit left the high priesthood way back in 150 BCE when the Maccabees were organized. And it was just an office up for grabs. Whoever paid off the governor got the high priesthood for that year. If he says it's not lawful, then the Romans can come and arrest him, telling people not to pay their taxes. If he says it's lawful, the people might turn on. It's a clever question, but he's more clever. Should we pay these taxes or not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a coin and let me look at it. And they brought a coin. And he said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said to him, Caesar's. So just as a quarter would have a picture of George Washington, a graven image, a raised image, the Roman coin would have a picture of Caesar, a graven image. Whose image is this? It's the image of Caesar. And Jesus said to them, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. And they were amazed at him. It's a brilliant answer. He gets out from under the trap. The image, now, but in order to understand what he's saying, you have to understand the first lines of Genesis. See if you can answer this question. If the image of Caesar is stamped upon the coin, where do we find the image of God? How did God create?
I would say it's stamped in our hearts.
Caesar's face.
The image of God stamped on the face of every human being. And God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. And he created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. It's so important that the Genesis repeats it. The image of God is on every one of our faces. We belong to God. The image of Caesar is on the coin. The coin belongs to Caesar. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God's what is God's. Now it has tremendous meaning beyond tax-paying issues. There are times when you have to give up personal convictions. Say like, I don't want to fight in a war to defend your country. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto the government what is theirs to demand. If you benefit from a country, then you have an obligation to defend it in its hour of need. But the rule that thou shalt not murder still holds. So one tradition calls a soldier an innocent murderer. Now, what's the difference between killing and murdering? Murdering is killing without justification. If your country is at war, many religious traditions, including Judaism and most of Christianity, except the pacifist branches, would say, yes, a good Jew, a good Christian goes to war to defend the flag. and freedom and all the things America represents. It's a kind of compromise with Caesar, with the government. So in a larger sense, you have to know when to render to God and when to render to Caesar. And when the government infringes on your personal understanding with God, there are times when you have to say no. Mike Pence did that. And when the government is asking you to compromise certain things in the time of an emergency, then you say yes, rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So it's the implication, you have to decide each time you're asked whether to say yes or no. That's up to you, your judgment as a free person. But the principle is very interesting. All right, let's go on. So that's his answer. In other words, he's saying pay taxes because the coin doesn't mean anything. He's not a political leader. He's not an economic theorist. He's not interested in that. Pay your taxes. The important thing is you. Are you living up to the image of God stamped on your face and your soul? That's the question, not the taxes and economics. I'm not here to do that. So he makes very clear he's not a political leader, but he's issuing a spiritual call. A distinction which you don't find so much in the Hebrew scriptures, where politics and religion are all involved. Where the one called the Son of God after the people of Israel is David, the king. He's a political leader, but he's also the adopted son of God. And whatever sins he commits, he still has a right to rule because God anointed him. So it's a different system. Here, there's a great hostility to government and generally organize things. The issue is, how does the individual stand before God? Jesus' kingdom is not built of bricks and mortar, it's built of hearts that have been turned toward God. Verse 18, next challenge. The Sadducees themselves come to him. Now remember, way in the beginning of this, we talked about the next life, the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come, and is believed in by the Pharisees, who are the ancestors of the rabbis who wrote the Talmud. And so Orthodox Jews believe in personal immortality because that's part of the tradition. I think conservative Jews in the prayer book say they believe in it. Whether the average conservative Jew does or not, I don't know. Reform Judaism blurs the whole thing. So our souls are immortal, but our personalities are not. It's not a necessary belief in Judaism one way or the other. It's much more central in Christianity. So let's see where Jesus stands. The Sadducees ran things in Jerusalem and they didn't believe there was a future life. The Sadducees came to him who say there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question. And they could ask this of any Pharisee who said he believed in a life to come. Rabbi, Moses wrote for us, this is verse 19, that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but leaves no child, the man must take the wife and raise up children for his brother. That's called levirate marriage. It was an institution in the ancient days. If your brother died, leaving a widow but no child, you were to take on as a, perhaps your brother's wife, try to have her become pregnant, and raise the child as a memorial to your brother, named after your brother. That was a rule. And you see it in the book of Ruth. So here's the dilemma. There were 7 brothers. This must be the basis of brides for 7 brothers. There were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and when he died, left no children. And the second, the next brother took her and died, leaving no children. And the third, I wouldn't marry this woman. And the third brother did the same thing, died without children. And she marries the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and the 7th. They all die, leaving no children. In the resurrection, in the next life, Rabbi, who is she going to be married to? Which of the seven? Jesus could have just said, give me a break. What a ridiculous question. But he doesn't, because he does believe in the resurrection life, that we have a next life and we're going to live eternally in heaven. And his belief is why it's so important in Christianity. The idea of salvation, meaning death is not really death, but we move on to a new form of life. So this is how Jesus answers, verse 24. Jesus said to them, is this not why you are wrong? You know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For when people rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. So that's his answer. There's no marriage in heaven. We're a different, not like ordinary people walking around. We're resurrected beings. And what came out of the tomb, when Jesus went into the tomb, the Christ that came out of the tomb is not exactly the one that went into the tomb. He has a resurrected body which can appear and disappear and go through walls and do all kinds of things. So we too will receive resurrection bodies which are not at all like human, ordinary physical bodies, and we won't be interested in marrying or not marrying. It won't be a question. We'll be like angels in heaven, whatever that may mean. Goes on to the next question. The issue of the dead being raised, which you don't believe in, but I do. Have you not read in the book of Moses, in the Exodus, in the passage about the burning bush, how God said to Moses, now listen to this, it's an interesting argument. Moses said, who are you? And God said, I am the God of Abraham. God. He is not the God of the dead, but the living. So you are quite wrong. So if God said to Moses, when Moses says, who are you? I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob must be alive somewhere, because he's not the God of the dead. Well, I don't know if it's a convincing argument, but it's a powerful one, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive, not dead. So it's an argument for the Pharisee belief that they're alive in the resurrection somewhere, or rather than the Sadducee belief that they're just dead. I wonder. If you think literally, I guess so. If you think metaphorically, I'm not sure it's that much of an issue. But in those days it was, because they took all of this quite literally. So he defends the Pharisee belief in the next life, which he shares, and of course dismisses the issue of marriage, because we're not going to be as we are now, and we're not going to be married or unmarried or anything else. So he answers the three questions. And now another one. And this is stunning, because this is the story of what's been called the righteous scribe. Say whether he's a Pharisee scribe or a Sadducee scribe. The scribes are just professional writers of texts. They were attached to both the Sadducees and the Pharisees. One of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that Jesus answered them well, asked him not to trick him, not to get him confused. He asked a genuine question. Which commandment is the first of all? Perhaps he expected Jesus to answer one of the 10 commandments. It's a very important question, which is the most important. But Jesus does not go to the 10 commandments. He goes to the book of Leviticus, which these were written by Moses, and he goes to the book of Deuteronomy, which they believe were written by Moses. So how does he answer? What is the first commandment? Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, V'kol avavcha, V'kol nafshecha, V'yadecha. A pious Jew says that prayer 3 times a day. Hear, O Israel, listen, O Israel. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your deeds. And the second commandment is like unto it. Ahavata l'reyecha kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as thyself. The two go together. Your question, I can't answer it directly. There is no one great commandment. There are two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbors yourself. And if you don't love your neighbors yourself, on whom the image of God has been stamped, then you don't love God with all your heart. You've got to love your fellow man. You've got to feel empathy, caring, compassion for your fellow man in order to really love the God and Father of us all. You can't love a man and hate his children or be indifferent to his children. You can't love God and be indifferent to his children. So Jesus answers very well. Love the Lord your God and your neighbors yourself. And he's quoting Moses. Judaism is the same thing.
Michael, you have time for a question? You mentioned that the Sadducees believed that if the smoke stopped rising from the altar, that the world would come to an end. How did they react during the Babylonian exile when there was no sacrifices at that time?
And they wrote the book of Leviticus in order that everybody should know when they had absolute faith, the temple would be restored. We are now in exile, not just in exile physically in Babylon, but in exile from God in a certain sense. We have to know exactly how to serve him as he likes to be served once the temple will be restored. Now, meanwhile, also in Babylon, there were people who were not in despair. The prophet Ezekiel, God's ark from the temple, and in his imagination, he sees flying to Babylon to be with his people. So the temple may be destroyed, but God is where the people Israel are, not necessarily where the land of Israel is. That's a tremendous change in attitude, but that's the prophetic attitude, which won out. Because when again the Jews were exiled, and they could take the Torah with them, take the words with them, even if the temple was destroyed. And Judaism has lasted for 2,000 years without the temple. And I think, I don't know, if some Jews want to rebuild it, but it would create such chaos. Most people. But the point is, yes, they were in terrible despair. They felt in total exile, that they were separated from God. And the minute they got back to Israel in 538, they built the new temple.
Right, but the smoke wasn't physically rising and the world wasn't destroyed.
Because in the foundations, they created an altar. They began to offer sacrifice immediately. They didn't rebuild it. The temple wasn't finished till 515 BCE, but they began to offer sacrifice.
Right, but there was a gap of 50, 60 years, you could say.
To the exile. But at the same time, when they got back, the priests tried to recreate the sacrificial system. But meanwhile, there were synagogues all over Israel, because synagogue Judaism, its more prophetic teaching, had been created in Babylon, and it's by the time they got back, there were all kinds of synagogues.
Right. So why did they fear that if Jesus interfered with the sacrificial system for a day or a week or whatever, that the world would come to an end? It didn't before.
Well, they felt that their relationship with God would come to an end. Let's put it that way. And if that were true, their world would come to an end. Perhaps I overstated it. The relationship between Israel and God would come to an end. Until the sacrifices would be reinstated. And they feared that the people simply was such that they had to get at him and get him to say something self-incriminatory so that the people's his lock on the people's sympathy would be broken. It didn't work. So now we have, I hope that answers. I overstated. The world they knew of the relationship between Israel and God would certainly have been sundered.
Well, when I'm back in Charleston, we'll go out for dinner and discuss it in greater detail.
Describe Unlike the others, not trying to trap Jesus, an honest man who's trying to get an answer. And Jesus gives him a great answer, a Jewish answer. By Israel, and then love the Lord your God and your neighbors with you. And how does this man react? Verse 32. And the scribe said to him, "You are right, Rabbi. You have truly said that God is one, and there is no other but he, and to love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more." And I see him pointing toward the temple and the smoke rising, is much more than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices. This scribe agrees with Jesus completely. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any questions. So this is the honest man, and Jesus and he embrace. Now, when Matthew rewrote this scene, because Matthew, writing 15 years later, it takes Mark virtually in its entirety, but adds a lot of stuff that Jewish readers would be interested in, ethical stories and things. So it's much longer than Mark. But when Matthew, despite his Jewish abhorrence of ever removing any text, does take away a few things from Luke, from Mark, which he just can't stand, this is one of them. Matthew is so hostile to any Jewish authority, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, whoever, that the story of this righteous scribe is changed. And it is Jesus who says all of this. And the scribe, you don't see the scribe agreeing with him. It's a totally, he can't even imagine one righteous scribe. So it's a little bit propagandistic, which is why I prefer the original here. You have a righteous man, and Jesus and he bombed. All right. And then Jesus has an interesting teaching, and this is going to be very confusing. I'm going to try to spin it out. And as Jesus taught in the temple, he said, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David?" Well, in an obvious sense, he is a descendant of David. He must be, but is he inferior or superior to David? And the suggestion is to call the Messiah the son of David is to make David superior. You need David's authority to validate the the messiahship of Jesus. But Jesus says, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, declared, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I put thine enemies under thy feet." David himself calls him Lord. So how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly. Again, they're very open to what he has to say. But what is he saying? It's based on the belief at that time, and even by many people today, that David wrote all the Psalms. They're called Psalms of David. Scholars know today that David only wrote a minority of them. They're written by many people over many, many years. So the argument is, if David wrote this psalm, that the Lord, God, said to my Lord, Jesus is suggesting that means the Messiah, Jesus, sit at my right hand and I will put the enemy at my feet. David calls the Messiah Lord. So the Messiah must be superior to David. There is a hymn in the Christian church, O come, Emanu-El, and it talks about Jesus as great David's greater son. So if David wrote the psalm, then God says to somebody that Jesus identifies as the Messiah, sit at my feet, sit at my side, and I'll put your enemies under your feet. And David, writing the psalm, calls the Messiah Lord. Therefore, the Messiah must be superior to David, and we shouldn't just call him son of David. Well, if you believe, the scholars today believe, that David didn't write that psalm, that was written by a poet about David, it means the Lord, that is God, said to my Lord, King David, sit at my right hand. So it has to do with David. Now remember, every king of Israel originally was called the Messiah. It was only later, when the dynasty fell, that the prophets conjured up a future Messiah who would be perfect. And he would come and be a great king, but all the other Jewish kings had been flawed. This one wouldn't. So they futurized and perfected the idea of the Messiah. But originally David was, and every Jewish king was called the Messiah. But now there's a distinction at this point. He was King David, and now there's the Messiah who has come, Jesus, according to this text. So only if you believe that David wrote the psalm and the second word Lord referred to the Messiah, does Jesus' argument make sense, if in fact he made it. It may be an argument about him made much longer, much later. So you see how complicated it is. I don't think the psalm says at all what the writer, he says, Jesus said it said, because I don't think David wrote the psalm. But if he did, then the argument is an interesting argument, and it indicates the superiority of Jesus to his ancestor David. And it's the kind of thing I think is probably written later on by Mark and put in Jesus' mouth, but who knows? Who knows? It's complicated. I hope I didn't confuse it too much, but it's a difficult text depending on certain assumptions you make about who wrote it. All right, so that's one of his teachings. And he goes on, he's on a roll now. Verse 38. And in his teaching, he said, beware the scribes, the professional writers. Now, a number of people could read, but I think very few people in those days could write. So you needed a professional class of writers to follow, to put down the holy books, the Torah and the others. But we beware of them. They're an elite class, and they like to go about in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the place of honor at feasts. But meanwhile, they devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Again, Mark's constant distinction between the ordinary people who hear Jesus gladly, the humble people, and the synagogue or temple big shots. Watch out for people who use the temple or the church as a means of social mobility to make themselves important in the community. They are as annoying today as they were 2,000 years ago. And there are such people. The church is their society and they rise to high office. A lot of them do because they want to serve, but a lot of them do also because they want to be a position of authority. Watch out for them, who use religion to advance their own social position. And meanwhile, some of them are slumlords, let's say, devouring widows' houses, but they make long prayers and they go to the synagogue or the temple and everyone thinks they're holy. Well, there's the distinction between the priestly and the prophetic religion. If you treat your fellow human beings like dirt and then go to the synagogue and are elected president of the church and become the board, there's something terribly wrong here. There was an issue in New York City some years ago of a church which discovered through a New York Post headline that the head of the board of elders of the church was a slumlord. He was outed. And the vestry met, what are we going to do? And some said, throw him out. We cannot. Paul said you can't be involved with sinners. Throw them out of the church. That's what Paul said. But Jesus, wouldn't he have said, keep him in and try to talk to him and get him to treat his tenants better and be a better human being and show him how to apply his Christianity to his daily life? Well, the church split, and there are now two churches. How do you deal with a public sinner in an organization? Jesus wasn't dealing with organizations. He could go to the sinner and appeal to him and say, your actions are terrible, but your heart is good. Let your heart, in the image of God, shine forth. Clean it of all that dirt you've piled on it. Well, that's what Jesus would do. Paul would do something else. Depends on whether you have an individual or an individual within an organization. And the church split. So it's still not a clear issue. But he denounces people who are big on ritual. They don't follow the moral law. And there's certainly plenty of those hypocrites around.
Michael, there's a question from Ellen.
Yes.
Sorry. I'd like to take you back a moment to verses 24 through 27.
Yep.
I find this very troublesome because it seems to me almost contradictory. On the one hand, Jesus says, for when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And then later he's saying he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. But is he saying that angels in heaven are living?
Yes. And so are people.
So there isn't.
Or in heaven. Or wherever they are, they're not dead.
So he's saying that the dead are raised, correct? He is saying that.
Jesus absolutely believed in the resurrection. His belief, the Pharisee belief.
I just wanted to clarify that because it seemed to me like he was saying two things, and I'm thinking, no. If there are angels in heaven, he's thinking of them as living, correct? And that would be where the dead are raised to.
The angels are living, and
Okay.
when we will be like the angels. Perhaps we'll be with the angels.
Okay.
And they are alive somewhere. So death shall have no dominion. Paul says, death, where is thy sting? Grave, where is thy victory? We have a victory through Jesus Christ over death. And he means it in quite a literal sense, as most Christians mean it, and some Jews mean it. It's certainly part of the tradition of both religions. But the Sadducees, whose function really disappeared with the destruction of the temple, I mean, we have a few, I'm of that lineage, and we have a few things we do in the synagogue which even rabbis can't do, but they're not major. The religion today is run by rabbis, and they are the descendants of the Pharisees. There's ordinary people who go to seminary for 4 to 7 years and learn lots and lots of stuff, and they're not really clergy in the sense that they're not priests. They're not hereditary clergy, but they're clergy by way of the laying on of hands, which we call smicha, which they get at the end of their rabbinic training. But the question of who is superior, priests or rabbis today, well, I've had to fight that out with a few rabbis. But the religions run by rabbis. And so in the traditional Orthodox religion, the idea of personal resurrection is there. Now, it doesn't mean that the minute you die, you go to heaven. Or does it mean that you lie in the earth for a long time until the Messiah comes, and then your body is resurrected and it meets your soul, which has been resting in God, and you are physically resurrected? Well, Jesus apparently thinks, well, that might be so, but it's not that we have bodies the way we do now that might desire to marry. It's a different kind of life which we can't even imagine, the life of angels, which we will share. So
He have said that there's a
personal,
would he have said there's a division between body and soul, that the soul had already ascended into heaven?
there's so many theories. The one theory is when you die, your soul is caught up in God.
Right.
That's the breath that he breathed into Adam's nostrils. It's the same in you and in me. It's not personalized. But your body goes into the earth.
Right.
But at a certain day of resurrection in the future, when the Messiah comes, the body will be literally raised from the grave and reunited with the soul, and you will live again. But Jesus is saying, whatever that combination may mean, it's not like an ordinary life here on earth. They are like angels in heaven. Now, I don't know what that means. Do angels have bodies? Physical bodies? I had a vision of angels in a church years ago, which had a deep effect on me, and I could see them. Was it a hallucination? Was I, did I fall asleep? Who knows? But it was a very powerful experience. Do angels have bodies? You tell me. I don't know. Some kind of body. As I said, in the Gospels, which talk about Jesus after the resurrection, he does things that he didn't do while he was alive. He didn't walk through walls. He didn't just appear and disappear. But in his resurrection body, he does. It's a different kind of body. Now, Paul says, in what form do they come? And he talks about a resurrection body, but he never defines it. Because who can? It's all matter of faith. Or you might say guesswork, or both. So I can't answer all those questions, but Jesus apparently thought that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not dead. They were with the angels, and so would we be. But not in the kind of bodies we have now, like angels in heaven, and we wouldn't be thinking of marriage or any earthly question. That's how we.
Michael, Pedro has a question.
Yes, I think I don't know your take on this, Michael and Ellen. I really focus on verse 25 in that his answer is, for when they shall rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as angels. And basically what he's saying is what you have said in quite an elegant fashion there. You can't consider it in the way you normally view things these days. And therefore, it's the old pigs looking at a watch. How can we conceive of an existence outside of time, which it would be, and outside, if it gets out of the questions of, well, the resurrection of the body, well, which body are you talking about? The 4-year-old body, the 88-year-old body, the body before the mortal sin, the body after the mortal sin? I mean, it gets into those sort of trick Pharisee questions, and the real answer is it's just very different and we can't understand it.
Well, I'm going to get the body I had when I was 20.
Well, the rabbis say 30. Michael, I have a question. Getting back to Psalm 110, why is there even a disagreement about that? When you say my Lord says to my Lord, in English, it's the same word. In Hebrew, there are two different words. One is the Yud He Vav He, and the other is Adoni. And Adoni never refers to God, even if David did write it or didn't write it.
It's a supplement. So I argue with Jesus' interpretation here, or whoever's interpretation this is. But it's typical of taking an ancient text, and whether you're the rabbis of Judaism or the writers of the New Testament, you make it say what you want it to say. And you know perfectly well here that's not what was meant. But that's what they wanted to say, Jesus' superiority over David, and so that's what they make it say. And you've got, that's what the rabbis are doing in the whole Talmud. You look at a Talmudic decision and say, wait a minute. That's not what Moses said. Well, it's all changed, and sometimes for the better. But whatever it is, interpretation has a wide swath here, and people say what they want to say, and they interpret it the way they want to interpret. And that's true of both our traditions. The rabbinic religion of Judaism is very different from the biblical religion, and yet the rabbis say, oh, it's all the same thing. It's not at all. They created a kind of new religion. And is Christianity as we know it the religion of Jesus? Well, we can't be sure. We have this story. But what originally did Jesus do and say? We'll never know. So we're telling the story. And there are a lot of, you might say, they take great liberties with the text, both the Jewish and the Christian commentary. All right, where are we? We have the righteous scribe. And the Lord said to my Lord, which is a mystery. And then beware, oh yeah, beware of the religious hypocrites. And they are with them then, and they're with us now. 40, it doesn't mean everybody. I mean, people think everyone who goes to church or synagogue on a regular basis is not following the moral law in their daily life. That's nonsense. There are a lot of people who do both. You don't have to make that choice between ritual and ethics. You can do both. And both are very important to a lot of us. And he's talking about hypocrites who are big on the rituals, which he wasn't very interested in, but where it counted on how to treat your fellow human being, that's where they fell down. So they've got to be called out. You don't come to a high position in the church or the synagogue if you're a well-known slumlord or you exploit your fellow man in some way. People should be aware of that. It doesn't matter just how many times you go to services. It depends on how you treat people. And I hope that would be a requirement. In order to get into the Jewish Country Club in Los Angeles, well, it's a lot of rich people, of course, in both the Jewish and the Christian Country Club, which are essentially across the street. They might, I don't know if they're mixed now, but they certainly haven't been for many years. In order to get into the Jewish club, you have to give an enormous amount to charity. And that's one of the requirements. How much did you give to the Federation of Jewish Charities this year? And if you can be fabulously wealthy and you haven't given your share as the admissions board thinks, you don't get in. Interesting. I mean, a good requirement. Verse 41, his last teaching. And he sat down opposite the treasury. It was a big box, the treasury, where people could drop their donations. The highest form of charity in Judaism is when you give, but you don't know exactly whom you're giving to. And the person getting the donation doesn't know who it's coming from. You give it through a third party, so it's anonymous, and the giver gets no credit. And the receiver doesn't have to be grateful to any single person. The highest form of charity, anonymous. Verse 41, he sat down opposite the treasury, the big box where people put money. And he watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. But a poor widow came and put in 2 copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him, and he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, her whole being. Beautiful, and of course, true. But it means more than what it seems to mean, I think. This is my interpretation. Jesus is about to give his whole being for humanity. And that's the ultimate gift. He owns nothing, maybe the robe he's wearing. He has chosen the way of poverty. And yet he is rich in the spirit. So is this widow. So when you give everything, your whole being, and that's more than coins, that's your whole being, as Jesus is about to do, this is the ultimate sacrifice. So I think it's a metaphor for what he is about to do in this last part. Now, we come now to the end of his teachings in the temple courtyard. But let's move on to a very distinct chapter. We're just going to begin it a little bit today. I don't want to get into the contents of it until next week, because it really is an important unit. It's called the Apocalyptic Discourse. And you have a sheet here, which I prepared, called the Apocalyptic Discourse. You have it there among the papers that you have before you, I hope. And this will make it much easier to follow. The Apocalyptic Discourse is made up of Old Testament, of Hebrew Bible quotes, put together at some time into a narrative, a prophetic narrative of what is going to happen in the days to come after the temple's destruction. So this is the beginning. Whether most scholars think this is not Jesus, but is an early church recital of events following the temple, which they now expect to happen that when Jesus returns. The death throes of the old world and the birth pangs of a new world. Jesus is certainly an apocalyptic preacher. He believed in the kingdom of God in two senses. In the terms of realized eschatology, meaning the kingdom of God is already here, but people do not notice it. We have to convince people that the kingdom of humanity is the kingdom of God. And it will burst upon the world in a greater sense. So realized eschatology is the kingdom's already here, but it's hidden. And apocalyptic eschatology is there's going to be the destruction of everything we know, the earth, the planets, the stars, the sun, the moon, everything will pass away. And then a new kingdom, the birth pangs of the new kingdom will arrive. And no man knows what that's going to look like. But it'll be a lot better and be ruled by God and the Son of Man. So Jesus certainly believed in apocalyptic eschatology as well as realized eschatology. It's not just in chapter 13, he talks about it elsewhere. But in chapter 13, this is the masterpiece of apocalyptic eschatology. And it's picked up by Matthew and Luke as a central teaching of Jesus. So let's just look at the setting of it and wait till next week to get into the body of it. In a sense, there are two climaxes to the book of Mark. One is when the women come on Sunday to anoint his body for burial and they find the tomb empty. The end of the book. The other is this, because this reaches far beyond that, to the future. Is it a distant future? Is it an immediate future? Did Jesus believe the world was going to end in a series of events, beginning with the temple's destruction? A quick series of events would take place, and then the Son of Man would return with glory, and the new world would be ushered in. Or is it a prediction of something quite distant? Well, that's for you to decide. The speech, as I said, is very complex. It reaches beyond to the ultimate future of the world and the coming of the Son of Man in glory. And it is carefully constructed from Old Testament sources. There's nothing here that Jesus says that's new. It's deliberately taken. It's a pastiche of quotes. And if you have that page in front of you, I have the reference in the Hebrew scriptures for every one of these predictions. So let's just set the setting and then we'll leave the content till next week. Chapter 13, famous chapter, self-contained. That's why I want to do it all in one class. And as he came out of the temple, he's given all these teachings in the temple courtyard. Now he and the 12 disciples come out of the temple through one of the great gates. Now remember, these are fellows from Galilee, fishermen, and very humble people. They've never been to the big city of Jerusalem before. They're gaga over these great structures, and especially the temple. But Herod had done some great building projects all around Jerusalem. And they're like somebody from Arkansas coming to see Times Square for the first time. And as they came out of the temple, one of his disciples said, "Look, Rabbi, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. It reminds me of the Broadway play, Everything's Up to Date in Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. They've gone and built a skyscraper 7 stories high, about as high as a building ought to go. So it's a country person amazed at a 7-story building. Well, these boys are amazed at the temple. Look at these wonderful stones and wonderful buildings. And Jesus said to him, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So he predicts the destruction of the temple. And again, when Mark heard about that destruction in Rome 40 years later, that's one of the reasons he said, I better write all this down. Jesus predicted that it took place. Now I can say everything else he said is true. That's the evidence. And so he wrote this wonderful story of Jesus. Verse 3. So Jesus is not impressed by architecture at all. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, he goes from Jerusalem and the Temple Mount to another mountain. You go from the Temple Mountain, which is Mount Moriah, down into a valley, and that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is, which will feature later in the story, and then up another mountain, the Mount of Olives. And I worked on the Mount of Olives for a summer in 1967, looking down on Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives is even a higher mountain. Now, why does he do that? First of all, the Mount of Olives is where the Messiah is said he will return. Orthodox Jews believe he'll return on the Mount of Olives. And so he goes from the Temple Mount to an alternate mount. Now, this is exactly what happened in Ezekiel. When Jerusalem was being destroyed and the temple was being destroyed, Ezekiel's got to get God out of there to show that when the temple's destroyed, our God is not dying. So he puts the ark, the throne of God, on the wings of 4 angels and has it rise through the roof of the temple and go to the Mount of Olives and sit there and watch the destruction of Jerusalem, which is not his destruction. He has escaped it. Ezekiel is brilliant. He saves the God of Israel from the destruction of the physical Israel. And his imagination has him fly to the Mount of Olives, watch the destruction, and then fly to Babylon to be with his people. Wherever his people is, that's where God is. That's new. Every other ancient God had a native land, and to some extent, so did our God. But he came to our people in Egypt, and he led them in the wilderness. He was just as much God there as he was in Israel. And then he deposits them in Israel. But then when they're exiled, he goes with them. He's the God of Israel, not a piece of soil, but of a people, Israel. And Ezekiel has done this. And so Mark does exactly the same thing. Now, Jesus doesn't fly through the air like Ezekiel had the ark do, but he walks down through the valley, Garden of Gethsemane, Valley of Hinnom, and then he goes up the Mount of Olives and he sits there, just as God made that journey at the time of Ezekiel. Very powerful stuff. And I think that's what's on its mind. So now he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, verse 3 of chapter 13, opposite the temple. What he has to offer is the opposite of what the temple has to offer. And Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately. These 4 disciples seem to be in the vanguard of his circle or inner circle. And they ask him privately, well, you said the temple would be destroyed. Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign when these things are all to be accomplished? And he began to say to them. And what he says to them is the apocalyptic discourse. Following the destruction of the temple, which he has just predicted, what series of events will take place? How long they'll take, we don't know. But what will happen until the consummation of the age and the return of the Son of Man in clouds of glory? And he'll go through a series of events which become more and more dire, moving from earthly struggles and wars to cosmic catastrophes. And then you will see the Son of Man return. It's a very carefully constructed of Old Testament verses, and we're going to read through it next week. And then I would say 2 more weeks or 3 from now, we'll be ready to start Genesis, and hope to get a lot of new students, because starting a new book, which many of them may be more familiar with than Mark, I think should draw some new interest and expand our numbers, which I'm always interested in doing. I mean, I'm happy to teach 20 people. 40 is better. It's just more. So thank you all for coming. Any questions or comments? The questions tonight were excellent. Always welcome. All right, we'll meet next week for the apocalyptic discourse and the prophecy of the end of the world. But if you want to know about what happened, tune in next Monday night.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Kogan.
Michael. Thank you, Michael. Good night.
Bye-bye.